Hello friends, old and new. This is the most important message I'll have shared with you so far. It's my personal message about avoiding the worst kind of outcome for humanity, which in fact is a war that ends in or includes an exchange of thermonuclear weapons. Not a fun topic, but one I've been thinking about since I was a kid, when in 1984 I watched the movie War Games, and it impacted me in such a way that I wanted to devote my life pretty much since then, and I have in fact done this, to avoiding or averting that scenario. And so while that's a heavy topic, it also goes along with the scariness of Halloween about emotional equilibrium as viewed through the discussion lens of a haunted house, or in this case, haunted trail, and asking why is it so much fun for us as humans to experience that? Why does our brain work the way it does? Why are we capable of war and aggression? Is it inherently bad, or is it sometimes appropriate? In fact, if we were to survive as a species as we did before we got super social in the Neolithic. So we'll go through history, talk about how we've progressed through history. That's kind of a different version of a haunted trail. I called it Humanity's Haunted History of War Trail. We'll cover that. We'll even play a little game of our own to decide if we go to war or not. We'll talk about some of the geopolitical realities of the world. But this is my message considered through the realities of neuroscience. And that's what this whiteboard here is all about, asking why does the brain work the way it does. But before we get into all that, we're going to start by doing the normal progression where we identify our sort of guest inspiration, Lex Fridman of originally MIT and the Artificial Intelligence podcast that he started. I can't help but compare him in my mind to Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, one of whom was an emperor, another a slave, both of whom were the primary Stoic philosophers. Lex Fridman, seems to embody a lot of that sort of mentality of being personally responsible for things, and only that which he can control does he worry about. And it's pretty impressive, actually. And while he's a public figure and a lot of people have heard of him, for those who haven't, I'm introducing his work, and you can check him out, I guess, on his work as his podcast. This guy is a strange attractor. He brings interesting people together for his podcast and different points of view. He's an honest broker, as I said. He identifies with a book called The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and the main character there. I don't disagree with him, but it doesn't mean he's an idiot. Peacemaker. I vote him, personally, the most likely to avert the big bad one, meaning the war that ends in something scary. This is a picture of the brain that I imagine for him. The biggest area is spent thinking about what is plasma. Next biggest is dog or cat, computer vision stuff. History, now, future. Likes peace. I think he'd want that. Likes Kipling's poem, If. Don't know what's in that part there. Over here is fruit. Over here is some stuffed animal that he's always had, that I can't remember what kind of an animal it is. That is, sometimes he's given away all his possessions except for this one animal, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a picture of him maybe giving it to a little Lex baby in the future. And then that's a sword and a shield, because you got to protect that baby. And down at the base here is stake. We're looking at things through the haunted house or haunted trail lens. And I wrote down the name of the best haunted trail that's ever existed. I'm quite sure of it. It's Markov's Haunted Forest. A really scary haunted trail. And it's really fun, too. Why? Why is it fun? Things like prediction error. Is the monster going to jump out from the left or the right side? I guessed wrong. He jumped from on top. That's fun. Immersion via sensory inputs. The sounds, the screams, the scary sights and the music and the smells. Fight or flight. These are the traditional stress and amygdala related circuits, responses to potential danger, fear, stress. It helps us to keep safe. Of course, emotions are to keep us safe. When we talk about achieving emotional equilibrium, we're not saying don't have them. We're saying understand them as best you can. Fun with cognition. In a haunted house, you might experience some images of post-apocalyptic zombies or nuclear wasteland or aliens with little guys on a table like that. That does not look good for that guy. So we might experience these things in such a way as almost an inoculation against the potential future horrors that we don't really want to think about. But we kind of want to think about them because we kind of want to address the fact that they're out there, but we want to acknowledge that they're not real. They're pretend, and now I'm leaving the haunted trail and it's all behind me. At the same time, they give us a chance to reflect on why we don't want those types of things to actually play out in our real world. So I endorse haunted trails. Much better to think about it in advance and decide that we want to avoid a bad thing than actually have a bad thing happen here. A lot of bad things have happened throughout the history of humanity. Enter, if you dare, onto the haunted trail of war throughout history of humanity. We'll start all the way back in prehistory in the Paleolithic. We got a guy, starts with a bone, moves to a hand axe, and for 1,000,000 years, the design of this thing was passed on from human to human. This thing was the tool, and also eventually spears and bow and arrow. Then we move into what we would call the Neolithic, which is early farming. This is the first time that you would have stores of food and resources that could be raided by warring parties. In the archaic periods, it would have been bands or tribes maybe fighting over a watering hole or hunting rights to an area, just like chimps do. Chimps have troops that go into battles and wars with each other over territory. We started to see walls. You would see wall cities like Jericho. And then eventually we're going to move now into the Bronze Age. You start to see swords, axes. There was a massive trade network throughout the world in the Bronze Age. Empires started to emerge, like the Hittite Empire out of Anatolia. In the Bronze Age, it progressed up until this one group of people, unknown who they were, called the Sea People, basically raided everybody and destroyed everything. And there was no more trade network after that. And the only empire that really continued to exist at that point was the Egyptians, and in a different form, and they were even battered very badly by the Sea People. We move to the Iron Age, which is then until now. As you can see in this diagram, we start with iron swords, eventually get into cannons, monster cannonballs to knock down huge walls. And so we started to see range extending beyond the thrown spear or the atlatl, which is a lever for throwing spears, or even the compound bow. The sling had quite a bit of range and was quite an early standoff weapon. But now we get into giant cannons. We get into eventually armaments like artillery and missiles and so forth. And then we move into the nuclear age and all that entails. In the future, these are two potential theoretical speculative futures that are the visions of two authors that I find compelling. The first one is a speculative evolutionary book that goes, I think, 1 billion years into the future and talks about human evolution. It's called All Tomorrows by, I think, C.M. Kosonen. The next is Dune, Frank Herbert's seminal work, which represents the golden path. Sometimes I like to think about things that could go wrong, and that's what I call prescient resilience. For emotional equilibrium, it's now time to delve into the brain science here, the recipe for limbic calibration, why it is that you can affect your emotional circuitry. It has certain levers and buttons and dials that you can pull, push, twist. Limbic friction. There's a little dial on a little remote control that you could imagine. You can turn up your PFC, the blue. You can turn down or up your hippocampus. You like to turn down your amygdala if you don't want to freak out a lot. There's a couple parts of the brain that actually are responsible for turning down the amygdala. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex kind of says, hey, calm down, amygdala. I'm here. I'm logical here, and I'm in charge. I'm the executive function. You need to calm down. And also, the septum is the opposite of the amygdala almost. It's a part of the brain that's in the middle. It's one of the parts that is not duplicated on both sides and mirrored, unlike the amygdala. We talk about the amygdala as if it's a single structure. It's mirrored on both sides, tiny little almond-shaped structures inside the brain. Same with the hippocampus. There's two hippocampal structures. Septum, there's only one because it's the separator. It inhibits freaking out. The septum regulates your amygdala-based fear and dislike and reaction. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex inhibits your bad reaction by saying there's no reason for that. Come on, be logical here. So your amygdala wants to freak out, and then there's inhibitory parts of your brain that want to calm it down. Some of the chemicals in the brain are either excitatory or, as I said, inhibitory. You'll probably have heard of GABA, glycine, or serotonin. Serotonin causes feelings of contentedness. Some excitatory chemicals that you can imagine, norepinephrine, which is simply adrenaline in the brain. Some chemicals do both, acetylcholine and dopamine at different times. Both have excitatory and inhibitory qualities. So what's going on here in this emotional circuitry? This time we're cooking in a sous vide cooker. It's a water-based cooker that circulates the water and keeps it in an exact equilibrium. So it's equilibrium exemplified. This time we're cooking some broccoli and some steak in there. You actually seal it in bags. I know it sounds strange, but it cooks everything just nice and perfectly tender. Unfortunately, it doesn't look so good when it comes out of there. You can imagine a steak cooked at 145 degrees in a sealed bag in water. It doesn't look great. That's why you move on to step 2 and you crank up the heat. and you sear that in a cast iron pan. Pink and delicious in the middle, but seared and crispy and perfect on the outside. Technology can help. Some people get scared of it. The reason that I'm endorsing Lex's sort of worldview is because I appreciate the fact that he understands past, present, future, but also doesn't fear technology to the point that we can't have nice things. I'm not talking about nuclear weapons. I know what Einstein said about them. There's Albert Einstein, in that cloud. And here you can see these guys here think the sky is falling. This one is throwing his hands up in the air. This guy's literally throwing his hands up in the air. They are in the air, and his hair is on fire. So in the end, our mission is to avert doom. And that's the mission of a group called the Macy Conferences that was established back in 41 and ran through 60. The most impressive thinkers of the day, sociologists, Margaret Mead, IT people like Hans von Forster, and other big mathematical nerds of the time were involved, and neuroscience was emerging at the time, and some of the most important and interesting early neuroscience was being described there. Things like artificial intelligence, machine learning were being described under the umbrella term of cybernetics, which I've explained, I think, in multiple videos. Involves usually a sensor, a controller, and an effector. The sensor saying, I want this temperature in this sous vide cooker to be 145 degrees. I will control the temperature to turn up or down as needed, and the effector actually turns the knob, and that keeps everything circulating and in equilibrium. I did, by the way, quickly, I want to point out about this sous vide cooker. I did draw it to roughly approximate the hero's journey that Bilbo or Luke Skywalker went on, which, if you're familiar with it, it's sort of segregated into 4 parts. The initial call to action, where the hero is thinking about logically, I don't think I want to do that. That doesn't sound great, to go off and battle the Empire. But then they have to anyway, and now the amygdala kicks in. That's why it's purple. You can see there's the amygdala drawn there, and the hindbrain. That's saying, freaking out, I don't want to do this. I refuse the call to action. Then eventually they have to do it, so their hippocampus kind of takes over and starts saying, all right, we got to do this. What do we know? How can that help us to make it through? Let's make some associations. Let's do some learning. Let's make some memories. And then once they're making it out of this ordeal, after the dark, hard trial that they've just endured, the green part here represents the neocortex, to which the learned lessons are permanently distributed and stored off into long-term memory so that the hero can return to the world and do good. That's the nature and the arc of the so-called hero's journey. What are the effects? What are we looking to accomplish through this discussion? It is to increase your own internal locus of control, which is to say, be your own hero. It's to increase awareness of yourself and others. If you understand your emotions a little bit better, you will have a better understanding of yourself and others. They are evolutionary goodness, here to protect us and help us, keep us safe. Approach homeostasis. That's this kind of balance where everything is in order and is equal and equalized until you need to turn on the heat. The heat represents aggression as needed, to defend as needed, to finish the thing as needed, finish the steak. But you make your best effort to approach homeostasis. Of course, no one is claiming and no one should be attempting to achieve perfection in this, because that's just not the way that works. Seek competence. Just do something you like and that you enjoy and that you can be good at. Logos theory is a reference to the worldview of a man named Viktor Frankl. You can read his book, Man's Search for Meaning, if you want, where he was in a Nazi concentration camp. He was a psychologist who had developed a theory called Logos theory, which related to people living for the thing that was most interesting and important to them. And he lived for saving this theory. He had written it all down, and it was the most important thing in the world to him, his life's work. And some guard found it once, and he had maintained this manuscript on his person for years, I think a couple years, and they found it and burned it. But the dude had the whole thing memorized and rewrote it. So we have his work. It's called Logos theory. All I'm saying here is check that out and then thrive. In the end, you just cycle back up and be your own hero. So this is a cyclical limbic calibration approach. Okay. What does it mean, limbic calibration? The limbic system is emotion related. It includes the big 4. Limbic friction we've described as being the turning up and down of attentiveness, arousal of the nervous system. Are you focused? Are you paying attention? Or are you kind of half asleep? Sometimes you want to get relaxed, de-escalated in terms of your arousal, and sometimes you want more. There's chemicals that play into that: caffeine, adenosine, nicotine. Adenosine is supposed to make us sleepy when we've been up too long, make the eyes droopy and you rub them and things like that. builds up in your system, and it's supposed to be able to park in the receptors of certain postsynaptic dendrites that receive the tired indicators and say it's time to go to sleep. However, caffeine parks in the same parking space as where the adenosine would have parked and plugs them all up. So your body thinks it's not tired because the adenosine, which is supposed to make you tired, isn't hitting the receptors because caffeine is in there until it wears off and you crash because the adenosine has not gone anywhere. It's been hanging out in your synaptic clefts the whole time, in between your dendrites the whole time. And now when the caffeine wears off, you crash, hence the story of caffeine. So you can use chemicals, you can use breathing as we've described. Dr. Huberman talks about one of the ways to do the opposite of caffeine and to calm down is the physiological sigh. I'll demonstrate it. Big breath in, little breath on top, let it out. 3-4 times of that. Tricks your brain through these, it's all circuitry just like before. Everything is flowing back and forth in here. It tricks parts of your brain because the diaphragm presses on the heart in such a way that makes the heart think, I don't need to beat as fast, I can chill. So it's neural circuitry that can be used to your advantage to increase or lower your level of arousal. That's limbic friction. The central nervous system is the brain and spine, and the projections that go out are the peripheral nervous system, including things like the vagus nerve, cranial nerve, heart nerves, which actually keep the heart beating even in the absence of the brain's direction. I think it's the only example where in the body a nerve cell has sort of its own thing going with that rhythm, that electrical pulse. And then gastrointestinal nerves, are really interesting. It's called the enteric nervous system. It's sometimes what you might think of as the sixth sense. It kind of connects to and talks to your brain in strange and interesting ways. It is why we have sayings like go with your gut and trust your gut. I'd also like to point out that there is a progression to how decisions get made. If I make a decision right now, and we call that Z, you can think back to the letter or the item before that, which is Y, X, and W, and V, and U, respectively. In the second of a decision, there's neurotransmitters 1 second before. Just before that, there was your chemical and hormonal conditions for the day. What did you have for lunch? How are you feeling? How are you sick? How have you been lately? How were you raised? What is your environment? What is your cultural environment? What was it like for you in the womb? What was your fetal conditions? Were you genetically predisposed to this or that? What's your evolutionary history going all the way back? And by going back in time, you can better understand behavior because of the topic at hand here, because of what's at hand in the world here. We all know that there are hot spots and they're about to get hotter. If you don't know that, then I'm telling you now that there are hot spots. There always have been. We've had a Cold War since I was young, since I saw that movie, and nothing's heated up enough to really get really, really hot. But what's happening in Ukraine, and certainly what could happen here or there, it's not isolated. It is interconnected. It must be understood as the human bioanatomy is understood. You can't have the lungs of the world, which we'll call the Amazon, let's say, burn on fire, all of it, let's say, and it not have an effect on the rest of the biophysiology of the interconnected world. So this is an example here of some of the things that are going on. This is the heart of global shipping, the Panama Canal, and this is a massive fleet that the U.S. has parked right over here. I'm imagining that this video might be helpful at some point, at some level, if people are stressed or worried about the state of affairs. This is one small part of a much broader global picture, and I think Lex understands it, and that's why I said if there's someone that's going to bring together the cooler heads of the world and maybe avert something bad, it would be him. I'm going to wrap this up by covering the Choose Your Own Adventure game and sort of explain to you my theory, at least, on what is appropriate and advantageous for society in general. And here's the way this would work. Just imagine that we start here. Let's go with an ancient archaic human at first as an example. There's some conflict. That troop or tribe wants your watering hole and your people, some of your people or something. They might want to take your kids with them or something. Who knows? That's a conflict. You can choose to either be strong or not. So yes, be strong, or no. These diamonds here are decision points. So if you choose no, that's an easy choice. You choose no, and then you get on the knees, and then you subordinate yourself, and that could work, and that would be one option. And then the next decision would be to resist, to change your mind later and decide that yes, I want to resist, which takes you back to tension. If you say, yes, I want to be strong and don't want to subordinate or be enslaved in some way, and you say, yes, I want to be strong in the initial instance, then you have tension. Doesn't mean that it's resolved. It just means that you say, no, I'm going to hold this bone in the air and say, you're not going to take my kids today. You're going to go away, or something's going to happen. And then you both start thinking. That's what these question marks are for, about, I might get hit in the head with a bone. I might get hit in the head. I don't think we want this fight. So you both leave, but there's tension. It simmers. They'll be back. They still want the watering hole and your kids. They'll be back. What we used to call mutually assured destruction in the Cold War, which is we both want to avoid this because it's going to be so bad for both of us, like a knife fight. You have to decide now, do you want to compete? You know they're out there. You know there's tension. You know they want your stuff and your life or your people's life. Do you want to compete? Do you want to do what you have to do to stop that from happening? Or do you want to halfway do it, or just not at all? Not at all is just subordination. Halfway doing it might be even worse. Let's just find out. You compete? The answer is yes. So that means you might arm up and you might train up and you might fortify your little village, and you might be ready so that there's not so easy to just do whatever to whoever inside the protection of your village. And in that case, it says here that you might either avert or win. And we call that, instead of MAD, mutually assured destruction, we'll call that bravery assisted defense. We don't know if it's going to work. It might or it might not. In the modern age, we say, if we're not talking about bones and tribes here, but now we're talking about nations and nuclear armaments, we say that we don't know if it's going to work if we're strong, but it might just be enough. So it's probably good because it might avert the war. Whereas weakness, subordination, a decision to not resist. So again, no more tension there. Nope, we're not going to resist. It just takes you right back to subordination. And then really it takes us over to, do we ever really even need to have a world war if everybody subordinates? So the answer is, there might not be a nuke, but the reality is that if you fight a world war and lose it, which is to say you compete but don't really try that hard, that would probably be the worst outcome, because that is the most likely that a nuke gets used. So what I'm saying is that if you're approached in the parking lot, give the person a look. That's good. If the person approaches you, have some semblance of a self-defense mechanism, maybe some pepper spray. That'll put down that guy pretty fast and you can get into the building. And so decide whether or not we need to compete against whatever the threats are out there, and the threat is the potential for escalation to war. Decide what is the best strategy for averting that. Is it weakness or strength? And then execute against that. And that's why there's a bunch of ships off the coast of Venezuela, because I think, if I'm not mistaken, the person that they're going to take out wants us all dead here in this country. Again, that's my interests. That might not affect your kids. That affects mine. And that's my purpose partly for making this video, is that as we start to see things on the news, it's scary, but it would be better if we could understand that it is part of our existence all throughout eternity of human existence. And up until about 10 seconds ago, we didn't have any kind of international norms and globe. It was, in fact, might makes right. That isn't a statement that says that's the case now, but I can tell you that our enemies think that's the case, and they exercise that worldview. So the response to that is either strength or weakness. The response to the war inside yourself about emotional, limbic friction and calibration and equilibrium, you're the only warrior on that front. You might have some support, but you have to do that. You have to figure it out. I don't have it figured out. I can tell you that. I'm just telling you how the hardware works. I'm not saying that I've figured out my own software. I'm simply saying these are the circuits that are involved. These are the chemicals that are involved, structures that are involved. I might do a lot more detail on this. I don't want this to go too long. These brain structures are just so interesting. The fusiform gyrus is involved in looking at faces and determining whether it's an us or a them. The anterior cingulate, we do deception detection, trust, us and them. And in the end, because of the way that humanity is, that we want to, we with our prefrontal cortex, we want to survive. Sometimes violence is the answer. Sometimes a cancer has to be cut out of the body, or else you have sciatica or something. If there's a tumor pressing on your nerve, the autonomic nervous system, which is just the normal processing, as compared to the somatic nervous system, which is purposeful action. So there's the parasympathetic. It's one of the autonomic nervous system's subcategories. And then there's the sympathetic, which is fight or flight. again, autonomic, everything is happening automatically. When the amygdala triggers and gets scared and sends projections all over the body, like we need to get ready to fight or flight, well, that is the autonomic nervous system. And what it's doing is it's sending signals to the right parts of the body. Your legs, your big muscles in the legs, if you need to flight and get away from that bear, you automatically start to deprioritize bodily functions that are not going to help your legs to run, and all oxygen, all power, all good stuff from the body transferred to the legs so you can run. And you don't digest, and you don't think about reproduction, and you don't think about resting or digesting in any case. All right, so with that, I just want to say that what we're doing and what we're seeking to do is achieve these effects and protect these things. These are the things that at least for us here in this country, make our country safe. A grid, critical infrastructure, food. There's the Teamsters driving a truck. There's healthcare. There's airplanes flying in the sky, air traffic controllers. There's a city that we don't want to see burn. There's Detroit and truck factories and car factories that are the first to be converted if things got very serious geopolitically. So in summary, let's not have a thermonuclear war. Thank you very much. Also, subscribe.